Massasauga Point. Let's take a look at this long-forgotten summer resort. Tonight, on Project Algerine. Presque Isle has changed considerably over the last several hundred years. It wasn't always attached to the mainland, and had long periods of time in which it was in fact a true island. With no roads onto the peninsula at the time, the only accessible beach, for the citizens of Erie to use, was known as Massasauga Point, or the Head, as it was known to the locals. The Head was a little piece of land that sat at the entrance of what is now Presque Isle State Park. The neck of the peninsula was much further west, and didn't connect with the Head at the time. Most of the city of Erie borders the bay, and has a steep bluff, making this area the closest and most accessible beach for the residents of Erie for quite some time. And that is what brings us here today. In 1868, a steamboat named the Minnie Harris was brought to Erie by Captain James Hunter, to provide passenger service from the public steamboat landing, at the foot of State Street, to the area then only known as the Head. Right around the same time, a small tavern was being erected by Jake Graham. The tavern was a plain structure of weather-beaten boards, consisting of 3 or 4 rooms, the principal of which contained a bar to which Graham himself presided. It wasn't much of a place, but the citizens of Erie loved the convenience, and it quickly gained in popularity. From that point on, this area was known as Massasauga Point. Picnic parties became more frequent, and the conveniences in the area increased. Jake converted an old shed on the eastern end of the property to serve and a makeshift dance hall. The immediate successes of the Minnie Harris steamboat, and the popularity of the new dance hall, caused an influx of new steamship captains, providing service to and from the foot of State Street. At the height of its popularity, the Massasauga Point dock saw more than 40 steamboats per day. The inside of Jake Graham's tavern was not much for show, but it soon became known as a place where fish were served up to guests in a style a little better than anywhere else. It also became the hangout spot for the amateur fishermen of the day. Massasauga Point continued to be a favorite picnic spot for the locals of Erie. After some time, larger organizations and private clubs, such as the Caledonian Club, started having their picnics at the point. The trend continued over the next several years, with the addition of larger corporate picnics, and the hosting of events such as a farm show for the farmers of Mill Creek Township. But things were about to change at Massasauga Point. The property that was now called Massasauga Point and home to Jake Graham's tavern, was owned by a farmer named Thomas Laird. Thomas sold the property in 1879 to the wealthy coal and railroad industrialist William L. Scott. Scott invested a great deal of money into improving the area. He added a gravel roadway through an old gorge that was previously used by a mining company to haul coal down to awaiting ships. These ships were delivering the coal to Ohio, to be used in a large iron smelting operation. This road eventually became Peninsula Drive. Scott erected a larger dance hall, which was an immediate hit among the locals. Landscaping and garden walkways were put in, along with a larger dock area. Due to increasing popularity, a hotel was constructed in 1885, of which David Johnson became the landlord. Johnson had been the current landlord of the Reed House. The Reed House was one of Erie's most popular and upscale hotels at the time. But Johnson, possibly bit off more than he could chew by running both hotels, and after the first year, bailed on his lease. The hotel was run for the next 3 years by Jake Graham's brother William Graham. That is, until one night after dealing with a group of rowdy hotel guests, the Massasauga Point Hotel catches fire. The fire engulfed the entire structure, burning for nearly 6 hours. By morning, nothing was left. Massasauga Point closed for the remainder of the season. After the devastating fire of 1879 that left Massasauga Point without its hotel, the owner, William L. Scott, was dragging his feet about where to rebuild. He wants to put the new hotel above the bluff, overlooking the bay, but the residents wanted a hotel on the point. The remains of the old hotel were left in the area for quite some time. Finally, after 3 long years, a new spot for the hotel was selected. Construction began in the early spring of 1883, and the new hotel was completed and opened by the start of that summer season. The reopening of Massasauga Point Hotel was widely celebrated by the residents of Erie. Although the hotel looks incredibly large in size, and easily had rooms for several hundred guests, it was indeed smaller compared to the original. Many years later, the hotel would be considered inferior, as it was always hard to live up to the original. Scott had a drill exposition here in 1885 and had 2 natural gas wells dug. There were 30 gas lights illuminating the property each night. When 2 fresh water springs were discovered on the property, Scott had his men bottle up and sell the water as Massasauga spring water. Records show that Scott had purchased and erected what could only be described as a rudimentary roller coaster. This wood-built structure was a remarkable piece of engineering, doomed by the harsh weather conditions of the location's off-season. By the late 1880s, the steamboat business from the public dock to Massasauga Point was at its height. Together these boats could carry nearly 2,000 passengers per trip. A figure that didn't go unnoticed by the new trolley company that had recently opened in Erie. The steamboat captains banded together, but their attempts to block the trolley company were unsuccessful, and one by one, the steamboats disappeared from Massasauga Point. With trolley service to Massasauga Point now up and running frequently, residents from Erie could access the beach by a trolley ride down West 8th Street, or what was then called the Lake Road. But that's not where our story ends. Daily trolley service brought an influx of Erie residents to Massasauga Point. The trolley allowed people from further distances to enjoy the beaches and grounds. Many people came here to get away from the hardships that city life offered. It was a place where dreams were created, romances were started, and hearts were broken. Everyone was happy, except the owner of the property, wealthy industrialist William L. Scott. Scott went ballistic upon discovering that the trolley company stretched its tracks down in front of his hotel, instead of bringing them down back behind the hotel, which would also allow for use of his adjacent property on the bluff. Scott then sued the trolley company, and had them remove the tracks back to 8th Street. It was at this time that Scott, being a railroadman, had his own trolley constructed down from 8th Street. This trolley could take passengers to and from the trolley terminus point, down the back way, directly to his hotel. It was this same trolley that Scott would use to ferry prospective horse buyers from his hotel to the Algerine stud farm, which was also owned by Scott. The trolley company sued Scott in court for running an unlicensed trolley service. Scott, controlling most of the property along West 8th Street, then sued to have the trolley company's tracks removed, all the way back to the city line on Pittsburgh Avenue. In the early morning hours of September 19, 1891, William L. Scott passed away from heart failure in Newport, Rhode Island. The lawsuits with the trolley company continued for several years even after William L. Scott's death, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had to get involved. Eventually, the trolley company purchased the land just west of Massasauga Point known as Hoffman's Grove. This would permit the trolley company to lay their tracks down to their property. The estate of William L. Scott leased the hotel for several years after his death. And several people tried to make a go at operating the hotel, but by this time, most people had made their way over to Hoffman's Grove next door, now renamed to Waldermere. To make matters worse, Mother Nature was changing the landscape again. And Massasauga Point was battered by several large storms that completely changed much of the area. Within a few years, the hotel and many of the other buildings were left abandoned. Almost everything at Massasauga Point had closed down by 1901. Waldermere Park had taken over where Massasauga Point left off. Massasauga Point is now just a memory. But memories can live on. You've been watching Massasauga Point on Project Algerine.